Hey 3DMJers, this is Eric Helms and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today you'll hear me talking to Amanda Rizzo, our team's mental health consultant, and my fellow coach and colleague Alberto Nunez, all about body dysmorphia. As you can probably imagine, because bodybuilding competitions are all about how you look, our sport can create, attract, and perpetuate individuals with body image disorders or unhealthy perceptions of their physique. Here at 3DMJ, we feel it's our job to help people identify and work through the inevitable distorted view that can come from competitive bodybuilding. It's also our job to keep an eye out for warning signs for what might be true clinical cases, so we can refer our athletes to the proper mental health professionals who can help them more productively within their scope of practice. So in this episode, we'll start by sharing a fair amount of information in terms of what body dysmorphia is, how it differs from some of the typical physique athlete behaviors and perceptions, and what to look for as signs of needing clinical help. We'll also discuss some of the common scenarios we run across as coaches, and some of the common scenarios that Amanda sees in her clinical practice. Finally, we'll provide some self-questioning exercises and techniques that may be useful for yourself or your athletes as a good first step to addressing this potential disorder. As per usual, if you have any feedback, comments, or questions on this episode, head on over to 3dmusclejourney.com or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave it under podcast number 147. So without further ado, here is All About Body Dysmorphia with Amanda Rizzo, Alberto Nunez, and yours truly, Eric Helms. All right. So I'm excited for this episode because I think dysmorphia, or in general body image issues, are something that most of the time when bodybuilders hear about it, they just immediately dismiss it because they think, well, that's not me. I do want to be bigger, but that's just because that's the goal of my sport. So it's one of these things where I think there's kind of this gross misunderstanding of what dysmorphia might actually be. And the difference between what is just the goals of you being a bodybuilder or a physique athlete, or maybe not even competitively, just wanting to get jacked, which I think is a perfectly fine goal. And then what actual, body dysmorphia, aka what is sometimes referred to, or one iteration of it, bigorexia, is. So I'm delighted to be joined by none other than the mental health specialist for 3DMJ, Amanda Rizzo. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me here.
It's a huge pleasure. And then also my brother in bigorexia, my friend who between the two of us we have at least 5 body image issues. Alberto Nunez.
I feel so inadequate. She's got like her stuff back there, and I have my Hulk poster. So, but I guess that's the root of my issue, right? Is the Hulk poster.
That just
right?
emphasizes the whole theme of the podcast.
Exactly. I mean, I think the Hulk says something about your internal insecurities, and I'm sure, all the degrees that we have in the background says something about ours. So
I give up on the green part, man. That's just not going to happen. But
I told you, just have to eat enough spinach.
More asparagus.
Yeah, either one.
I said asparagus. So.
You know what? They both count. Why not do both? I mean, more micronutrients, more potential for skin
I've
pigmentation.
made myself orange before. I think a lot of bodybuilders have. Well, we can get into that later. But yeah, the beta-carotene poisoning. Yeah.
Pumpkin or sweet potato?
It's typically the pumpkin craze, especially when people just started buying it in the canned version, adding it to everything, just to add fiber and fluff. And the next thing you know, it's like, why are you 4 months out and you get a protein layer?
Orange?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's not protein, and I'm not even on stage yet. So, Amanda, can you tell us kind of what the actual definition of body dysmorphia is, por favor?
Definitely. It is actually a full-blown criteria in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. And the first premise is, or first criteria is, a preoccupation with one's look, whether it's their body, a physical characteristic, facial features, hair, and in this case, for competitors, it would be their muscle. And that is actually a specific specifier in the criteria for muscle dysmorphia. And you'll predominantly see that in the male population. However, let me backtrack. At some point during the quote unquote disorder, the individual will have a preoccupation with their physical features, and they'll do repetitive behaviors such as body checking, or they'll pinch themselves, or they'll pick their skin for whatever other body dysmorphia they have. And then on top of that, they will have clinically significant distress. So it'll impair their social areas in life. It'll impair their academic if they're in school. It'll impair their work functioning. And it won't be explained by another mental disorder. So that's how we distinguish the two from eating disorders, because we do see body dysmorphia within eating disorders. So we have to delineate the fine line between that. And then as well as with competitive athletes, like, when do we say, like, this is an issue?
So I've got a question, because I think folks like us probably typically only get exposed to the concept of dysmorphia within the context of reading something about bodybuilding, sport, or lifting, or anabolic steroids, etc. Let's get completely away from muscle dysmorphia. Let's talk about just dysmorphia in general. Where do you see this completely outside of this population? Some people probably, when they hear dysmorphia, they automatically think of muscle dysmorphia. But like you were saying, it can be completely unrelated to that. And what is the root of it, and what does it really mean, kind of broadly?
Right. There will definitely be underlying obsessive compulsive tendencies, perfectionism. You'll see an undercurrent of depression, general anxiety. So that could be the prerequisite. Kind of like what came first, chicken or the egg. And then you'll see it manifest to focusing on the body. And you can see this in many cultures, not just within the fitness area, but you'll see celebrities with it. You'll see anyone that's in the spotlight, anyone that has to be up in front and center with people. Or you can just see this as high school girls struggling with body dysmorphia.
Right.
So it can affect any population.
Okay. And when does it typically, so you as a practitioner, as a therapist, when does it actually come to your attention? What is typically the trigger that results in someone actually coming into your office, or maybe their parents bringing them into your office, or sitting down and talking with you? How does this cross a certain threshold where someone's like, this is a problem in my life. It's affecting my happiness, my quality of life, my ability to be me. What does that look like from the practitioner perspective and experience?
Actually, from my experience thus far, it's usually the other things that bring them into the office before just the body dysmorphia.
Right.
I have rarely seen a client come in just specifically for body dysmorphia. There are usually other elements in their lives that are completely out of whack or very stressful, and the body dysmorphia and the linked behaviors are just a side component, and that's kind of like their outlet. That's their one way to feeling in control, which is similar to eating disorders. So it's usually compounded with other things.
That makes sense. So I guess you brought up the chicken or the egg, which is almost always a really interesting thing in cognitive behavioral things. Is the behavior as a result of a self-belief, or does it continue it, or where is that? So it sounds to me like, at least experientially for you as a practitioner, as a clinician, that maybe the behaviors related to body dysmorphia and those beliefs and the physique checking and the things they do to modify their body are more coping methods to deal with whatever the underlying psychopathology is, or maybe even the expression of that, obsessive compulsive disorder. There has to be some behavior that is obsessive compulsive. It might be that that's their nutrition. Okay, so that's okay. Cool. So
Absolutely.
Well, not really cool. But,
so even though these behaviors can be distressing, to some level and extent, they provide relief for the person. The same thing with OCD. There are compulsions where they do not want to necessarily engage in, but the repetitive behaviors allows them to feel relief.
Okay. So I would imagine, given that they have some type of both potential facilitative and debilitative role for the person, this is a great example where I think our scope of practice, knowing the limits of our scope of practice, is important. We run into, and I'm sure Alberto can speak to this, we run into a lot of behaviors that are like pretty borderline obsessive compulsive among bodybuilders and athletes. Are like they have their pros and cons. I think there's very few things in life that we do that don't have good and bad elements. Like, we just released the transitioning away from tracking, myself and Steve, that course. And I know for a lot of people, that's a really difficult topic because tracking gives them a sense of control. Tracking gives them a sense of constraints and boundaries, and that often could be underlying something like the reason why they need these constraints and these boundaries and this tool to modify something is they're not happy with their body. It may be subclinical. It may not meet the DSM criteria. But then telling them, but they also express, hey, tracking causes problems in my life. When holidays come around, when friends come around, when I go out to eat, or when I don't have the ability to track, it turns into something totally different, like, bulimia or binge eating disorder, et cetera. So it's one of these things where it could be a cushion or it could be like a pin that you're sitting on, depending on the scenario. So I know for me, that's something I struggle with when I'm faced with a client who has this cognitive dissonance. They're like, I need to do this, but I don't want to do this. So what is the approach towards helping someone manage these behaviors that have both negative and positive roles for them in their life?
Right. Which I think it's a great subject because, especially for competitors, tracking, being very diligent, and borderline neurotic is what makes a competitor win, or it just gives them that competitive edge. So where do we say, like, this is problematic? And I'm going to speak in the context outside of contest prep. Mm-hmm. So I think first and foremost, recognizing and having the client be more insightful and self-aware of, okay, how problematic is this? How long do I want to continue this behavior? Whatever it is, whether it's tracking or going to the gym 5 times a week, how sustainable is this? And is this something that I want to do long term? If no, then we start breaking down the beliefs that they have around certain things, certain topics, because they created beliefs to say, like, okay, tracking is what gives me control, and it is the quote unquote only way that I know how to control, which is false, because maybe in the past they have had better or worse behaviors. So we start breaking down those beliefs and then creating new ones, and that's up to them. They create the new beliefs where they can function better, whatever that means to them. So if that means, like, maybe I can have 1 untracked meal a day, that's as much as I can handle. All right, we start from there.
Totally makes sense. So what I'm hearing here is there's some fundamental, what I might frame as negative core beliefs that someone has that leads to a behavior for them to manage that. And it starts to create this cognitive dissonance. So let's, for example, say they may not even rationally realize this, but they get to this place where they go, I'm not valuable, or I'm unlovable, or whatever it may be, because
right.
I don't fit a certain mold. Or maybe the only way I know how to be lovable or valuable or have worth is to fit this mold. So that I'm doing these behaviors to fit this mold, yet doing those behaviors is causing me problems. So it sounds like there's kind of a 2-pronged attack here. You have to address the underlying negative core belief, and then also from the other end, kind of from the CBT side of it, or I guess the behavioral side of it, go, okay, You've acknowledged to me that these behaviors are causing you problems. We want to change them. And you're going to be the gatekeeper towards what is the first compromise, the first step we can take towards starting to step away from these behaviors, at least exploring other options. I know from my limited experience, with therapy, but as a person in the therapist's office, and then also having family members who are therapists, this has to be kind of a graded thing. Like, you're not going to step away from a negative core belief that you've had for decades in a single session. And I know I think people are probably familiar colloquially with the concept of like affirmations. Like we've all, the joking version that's on like SNL from way back in the 90s, like, I'm great, I'm beautiful, and gosh darn it, people love me, or whatever it was. But that affirmation, if you were to actually try to use that in clinical practice, most people who had a really destructive upbringing, they're going to be like, they'll say it out loud, but in their brain, that the inner critic is going, and bullshit,
Exactly. It's too far out of their comfort zone. So like you said, you have to scale it. You have to go more general and even just more neutral. So let's say, for example, someone that has negative core beliefs that I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm a failure, I'm ugly, XYZ. We'll start with, okay, I can drive my car, or I have a stable job. It's very general. It has nothing to do with those core beliefs per se. It's nothing direct. But you start scaling it that way and gradually get closer and closer to that triggering core belief. It's kind of like behavioral shaping.
Yeah, it's just, I can imagine. I've been for certain things in my life, and I've talked to other people to where the level of self-judgment and holds them back so much that the idea of seeing themselves in a positive light it's so far out of reach, and so like you said, you have to start with something like really low-hanging fruit and just nudge closer and closer. And like I've had friends and family who've gone through this process, and it's a huge step for them to get to the point where they say, like, I'm enough. And that might be it. Like, I'm not good, I'm not even acceptable, but I'm enough. Like, this is okay. And I can just get that part of me that constantly brings me down, just to not say anything for a little bit. So that seems like that's one angle, but the other angle is actually this kind of graded exposure to just trying different behaviors. And so it sounds like, because the chicken and the egg are both present, both arguably the chicken and both arguably the egg, that you address both? Or is there a certain order? Do you try to address the negative core belief first, or do you try to kind of turn down the volume on those behaviors that are causing distress? Or which one to you in practice do you address first? Which one's the egg and which one's the chicken for order of operations?
Yeah, I wouldn't say either or first specifically or absolutely. I think it's more of an individual basis and where the client is ready to go. Yeah, it's very client driven, very individual. Some people are ready to just dive in and start changing the behaviors and then modifying the beliefs along the way. Some need to go a lot slower and just talk about other issues that are going on and then mitigate those, have those somewhat in the back burner towards the end, and then we can start tackling on the behaviors that are more problematic.
And so what does that actual process look like? Even though it is client driven, I imagine there's a certain approach or methodology that goes into getting some of these obsessive behaviors or quote unquote dysfunctional behaviors to be lessened. You gave the example of having 1 day per week where you don't track or something like that. Like, what is the typical process? Send me in the context of health, nutrition, training, etc. What might that look like?
Aside from not tracking a certain meal, probably maybe not training a day, or not intentionally skipping, but just exposing them to that they're not going to like lose all their gains, or they're going to suddenly get fat. Have them imagine it first. Have them visualize it, feel it, And then I'll shift how they're feeling during session. So they'll imagine how they want to feel instead. I'll do all of that during session, and then they're able to go out in the quote unquote real world and implement that. Because what happens in session is a microcosm of the outside world. So I think first visualizing and then imagining how they want to feel will transfer over well, instead of just talking about some things in session and then having them go try it out on their own. I like to go step by step with my clients and just go along the journey with them.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's a very like, it's a pretty risky behavior. Like if you have this belief that, if I don't go to the gym, I won't be able to, not be whatever or be whatever that's tied to my negative core belief. So it's a really emotionally risky thing to train 4 days a week instead of 10 or 8 or 6 or 5 even.
For some people it is.
Yeah, because it's tied to that negative core belief. So the idea of simply, hey, just imagine what it's like. Not only will that, it gives them kind of a safe, controlled simulation environment to where they can feel those feelings and, be prepared for that and try it on before they actually have to go out in the quote unquote real world, like you said. But I imagine you can also, once they have that emotional response, if they're willing, you can follow that thread and be like, all right, well, what's that emotion tied to? Like, what are you afraid of right now? I know a lot of the folks who I've talked to who have an unhealthy relationship with exercise or food, they can't always, or maybe they don't want to, just to me in discussions, they don't always have the awareness of what is the root cause of this. So how important is that, is helping someone determine what the inner piece of them that is really using this behavior to feel okay, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say across the board that it's absolutely vital for them to identify it. There are certainly people that can just shut that off and then switch gears and change their behaviors. But I do think it is very useful to identify what the root cause is. And usually it stems back to some sort of event that didn't sit well with them, whether it was traumatic or triggering, or somewhat insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it stuck with them. So having them go back to that time, recognize the link between it, will allow them to shift it and catch it again, because it's a perpetual pattern. And they're just attributing the going to the gym or their nutrition to it, to cope with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So again, that ties to the core beliefs as well.
Right. So if you can help them understand what was that initiating event that sometimes in the grand scheme, like you said, might have been, insignificant, at least from our often now adult lens, looking back at us as children or young people and forming these associations, that helps them realize that that's a pattern. And I think that's really important, because you were talking about forming new beliefs, which is client driven. But if you can't identify and see what your old belief was, then you don't really have that opportunity to make, a new decision about who you are, what you do, or what it means. So I've always felt like almost one of the biggest side benefits of being in therapy personally is to give me that space between acting and feeling. And I think, this is something that meditation is important for as well. But in general, I know when like you use the word trigger, which people joke about and laugh about, but I think it's an appropriate term for some of these emotional responses in my experience, because it's immediate. You pull the trigger, the gun goes off, and that proverbial gun is your emotional reaction and the cascade of behaviors, like in this case, a binge eating episode. So how do you give someone that space to have at least the opportunity to make a new decision, even if they may or may not be emotionally ready to see themselves differently or make a new choice. But that seems like to me one of those early steps. Like I just need to be able to be present enough to see that I'm going down this path again, this knee-jerk triggering response.
Mm-hmm. It is. It functions on a subconscious level, especially when it's already a pattern. I would say once someone gets very proficient in describing what they don't want and don't like, it becomes easier to identify what it is they do want. So with that, I would say having them describe all of these beliefs that they don't like, they don't feel good. I'm sure they do not feel good. So that would bridge the gap again to, okay, how do I really want to feel? Maybe it's a little more neutral. Maybe like feeling bliss and happiness is too far out of my reach. Maybe I just don't want to feel anxious for 3 hours out of the day. Mm-hmm. And that gives the client that space and that freedom to define whatever it is they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this reminds me, and this may be a little before your time, at least, Amanda, and I don't know if Berto, you remember this, but I think it might have been SNL, or it might have been actually Mad TV, but there's this skit, I want to say it was Bob Newhart, and it's just called, he's like purportedly a therapist, and you come in, and he says it's only 5 minutes, it's like $10 or whatever, and I can fix any problem no matter what it is, and you just tell him your problems, and once you finish, he just yells, "Stop it!" at you. You know, like, I think sometimes when we hear about these behaviors, and even when we're looking at it internally, like rationally, it doesn't make sense that I do this. It doesn't line up with my goals, but I don't necessarily have the agency to stop it. That's sometimes like just the frustration that we feel looking at ourselves, or when we talk to our clients, if we don't fully understand this stuff, or if we don't have, like an Amanda on call, it's this kind of scenario like that. I know that should never be the case, but where beyond explaining to them why this isn't rational, we don't have any tools. And I think that's almost kind of like this adult bias, like we, presumably, as you become older and older and more rational, you're operating more from this place of evaluating the pros and cons of this, looking at it logically, quote unquote, and then making a decision. But I think we forget just how much of what we do is based on these very early developmental pattern recognition behaviors, where we associate two things on a very deep neural circuit level that result in these behaviors, and it feels right, it feels good, but then it causes problems once we're not 6, 8, 12, 13, 16 anymore. And I really like that skit because it spoke to, at a very early time, kind of society's just lack of understanding, that it's not just if you understand rationally why something doesn't make sense, you can just, of course, change it, and kind of, making satire of that, which I think was really important. So yeah, with that bit of a preamble, Berto, I want to ask you, so how often, and do you have any certain cases that come to mind when you think of this? Have you as a coach had a client who they have some belief or view about their body or resultant behaviors that results in a pattern that, even though you explain to them and you can talk them through it, it doesn't necessarily, it's not enough to change it?
Well, I think just going back to the start, what Amanda said about, what we see, well, especially in our end, like we see the body dysmorphia, but prior to like it being obvious that this person's dealing with that, it's a quick thought in the back of your mind. You're like, why did you pick this sport out of all things? Because like it makes people who, maybe they were just always kind of look like a mesomorphic sprinter. Just like abs as far as they can remember, chiseled. They just always had that body that everyone wants, and they're kind of doing this. And obviously, those are like the freaks of the sport, but still, even within the freaks, like you see those sort of issues. So when you take someone who I guess are using this to fix or kind of regain control of certain aspects of their life, it's like man, this is probably not the best way to go about it. You probably have some attributes that you've developed because of all this that you have going on that it can be advantageous in this sport, but this is not the solution for what we have going on. And a lot of people often see it as that, and that's really unfortunate. So, but it's always going to be that way. I think it's this sport, this hobby. It's always going to gravitate most towards those sorts of personalities or people who are prone to that type of behavior. So yeah, when she said, I'm like, yeah, that's basically it. And it's like, yeah, I see that last leg. I see the body dysmorphia, but it's like, damn, this person's had like 4 divorces, and they have all this, they can't hold the job, and it's like there's other things going on before the bodybuilding came into play. Um, so yeah, when have I seen that the most? Probably during contest prep, because I think that's when people just become much more transparent to whatever their issues are. Like I know from personal experience, like I know what I'm prone to during a contest prep, and certain silly things that I'm trying to work on. It's like they become. Yeah, it's when you're least objective and you're just like this. You're just this big impulse basically half the time. Like you really go primal with your brain, and like you said, you resort to those things that are deeply embedded in you. That's what kind of guides you, and that could be that's a really cool thing I think about contest prep, is that if you're aware enough, is like you can see that and you're like, oh, I need to work on this because it's probably there all the time. I just don't see it when I'm a little bit more well fed. But yeah, contest prep, it turns some of the most poised and composed people into all sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a funny observation. I think a lot of people just look at that as purely as a negative. Like, yeah, contest prep, I'm at my worst at I think certain phases you actually do better. Like the early on, you're liking the way you look. You're past that tweener phase. You still have enough food. You still have enough body fat to produce leptin. You feel fine, and good. Life's better. I'm maybe even more productive, more focused. I'm goal oriented. But there's inevitably becomes a certain point which we always frame as negative, where your coping mechanisms are depleted. Your actual physiological status is one that doesn't handle stress as well. And essentially, all those little things that when you have that space we talked about, to have an adult moment, to think slow, to consider reactions, it goes away because everything becomes the straw that breaks the camel's proverbial back. And then you can see all the underlying stuff that you're managing. But the thing about managing something is it's still there, One thing, and obviously this happens at the clinical and subclinical level, just depending on, what your background is. I have definitely had a number of clients, unfortunately, over the years who were in what they might call remission, or they had an eating disorder, or they had a certain issue, and then contest prep, it comes back. And it's kind of this unfortunate thing where it's like, they might have learned all these skills and they might have cultivated a new belief, but this all engrossing focus and this almost by nature obsessive goal and the elimination of all these abilities to manage your stress and putting yourself in the environment that's worst for handling stress, and all of a sudden the thing that you thought was a chapter in your life that has closed. Oops, you turn the page. Chapter 15, the ED is back. Eating disorder is back, or body dysmorphia is back. I think, but like I said, framing that purely as a negative, I think that's an understandable knee-jerk way of looking at it. However, it is another opportunity to go, oh, wow, this is not gone. There may be more things to follow this nugget, or this line back to the internal nugget, address some of these beliefs and learn even more new skills. Because people who can manage these issues during contest prep, you can pretty much manage them in any situation.
I think the next point of attack would be identifying the functionality of those behaviors. For example, the individual who maybe had an eating disorder in the past and it was in remission for many years and then went into contest prep and totally fell back in. What are those behaviors functioning for that individual? Like, how is this serving them? Because clearly it's serving some sort of purpose, whether it is to feel good, feel in control. They're trying to cope on some sort of level. And then we would look at, all right, so what else is going on here? There's something that wasn't uncovered before. Yeah, and it's not to label it good or bad. It just is like what is going on here, and how can we replace this behavior with something more functional, something more pro-social, something healthier?
Amanda, I think that's probably one of the most important points in this discussion, or anything related to therapy or behavior change, is that kind of that standard cliche of like, I'm broken, fix me, while it is, I think societally, it's helpful to look at, mental disease, mental stress, or mental disorders is the same as physical, in that they shouldn't have a stigma, and we shouldn't be seen as less than or weak or anything like that. However, it is not like a broken ankle. The things that we classify as in the DSM, like you were saying, at some point they served a purpose.
Exactly.
If you were the middle child in a dysfunctional alcoholic family, and you're the one who's always trying to make everybody okay, and you end up being like the middleman or middlewoman in a scenario, that you're the mediator, and you're always trying to conflict solve, you might be fantastic in your role at HR and whatever job you are. However, it may also lead to codependent relationships and you making a lot of things okay that shouldn't be later in life. And being in unhealthy relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just one random example that popped in my head. And I think if you purely frame it as, this is bad, I am broken, I must fix this, it doesn't change those negative core beliefs, and it just adds to them in some cases, and doesn't actually give you agency to do anything except be frustrated and feel stuck. But if you can acknowledge the fact that, holy shit, as a 4-year-old in this terrible home environment, I actually made it okay and safe for me to the degree that I had agency as a 4-year-old. That's pretty cool. I have some power. I had some agency. It's not working great now as a 35-year-old, person who's at the end of the rope of a marriage and trying to negotiate that. But it landed me this cool job in HR. I have that skill set. It has some problems, but if I could acknowledge the good side of it, that really is kind of a more compassionate way of moving forward. And I think in behavior change in general, if we kind of get more to this kind of the realm of like, pop psychology and goal setting, but still that has some validity, it's much easier to replace or attach a behavior to an old one. Like if you want to take up exercise, you pack your gym bag, you put it in the car, and then when you leave the office at 5 p.m., it's right there. You're much more likely to go to the gym, and you're reminded by, when I leave work, if then I go to the gym across the street. But if you had to go home, grab your stuff, leave, drive 30 minutes in traffic and go to the gym, it likely wouldn't happen. You might forget, or you might just decide not to. There's that gap where your willpower could be depleted, quote unquote.
A bigger chance, right?
So it's like in this scenario, we're saying, hey, it's really, really difficult just to have the lack of a behavior, a coping method, and a self-belief. That's not how humans operate. We don't just remove a part of ourselves. You don't get to kill the inner critic. You don't get to, remove a behavior that actually served a purpose and has served a purpose for probably your age minus, some single digit number years. It's more like, how do we mold it? How does it become something that serves you now? Is that an accurate kind of framing of what we're talking about here?
Yes, absolutely. And just like you said, it presents itself as a more compassionate perspective, not only from the clinician's point of view and delivery, but for the individual themselves, to see themselves as, hey, I was doing my best. As cliche it is, sometimes we really do need to tell ourselves that.
No, I 100% agree. And I think that also leads you to, if you can see how, whoa, I can't believe as a 4, 6, 8, 12, 13-year-old, I figured out a way forward. May not be perfect fit now, but for the jigsaw puzzle I had then of trying to make it through life, I found a piece, I think that then tells you, hey, maybe I have the agency, the self-belief, or the ability to find the right piece this time, or to change this piece that I have and fit it. If we're not that you're technically allowed to use a knife in when you're building puzzles, but in psychology you are, I guess. But anyway, I think that can be an inversion of something you came probably to your office to see as a negative, to see it as a positive, to lead to the self-efficacy, to see maybe I can do this, which was I remember when I went through a bit of that was mind blowing to me. To thinking back of some of the stuff that I was doing in certain periods in my life that I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. But then feeling proud of the thing that I came in to change, which allowed me to do something else. And I was like, you just did some voodoo. I don't know what you do, but it was voodoo, Mr. Therapist. So, yeah. What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or an athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, in audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits for most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the Products tab. Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening. So, Berto, I'm thinking about times where I've seen physique sport both be debilitative for someone with kind of this background, like you were talking about. Like, hey, you came into this with a great physique. Everyone would just love to be like you, but now all of a sudden you're comparing yourself to others. There's this standard, and it's very difficult for you to feel satisfied or even proud or happy with what you currently have. Are there times you've seen people use bodybuilding or physique sport in a facilitative way that's actually help them rather than kind of, torn them down or changed a perfectly healthy individual into someone who now has struggles?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Berto.
Oh, actually, Amanda, take it first. Berto can go second.
No, I wouldn't say bodybuilding per se. At this moment in time, usually I have already athletes that have been athletes for a while come to me, or the opposite. Where someone who has never exercised before or has stopped exercising for years, and they go back into the gym after doing some pretty heavy self-esteem work, self-confidence work, step back into the gym and say, hey, I love this. Like, I'm learning to love my body a lot more. So in that case, yes, whatever fitness one gets into can definitely be a positive factor for them.
Yeah, I guess it's a huge fear of someone who is using training or fitness or nutrition in a way that maybe started positive and then became negative because of their previous experience, or they came into it with good intentions, but then it became this facilitator of their muscle dysmorphia or eating disorder or whatever it might be. The fear that they probably have is, if I go try to deal with this, they're just going to tell me to stop. You can't, like, this is bad. Training isn't good for you. I know in a physical sense, I've known a number of people who have like reoccurring back pain or neurological symptoms or some physical ailment, but they refuse to go see a physical therapist or a doctor because they expect them to tell them stop lifting heavy, and they don't want to do that. And it ends up becoming way worse than if they'd just gone in, and they're making an assumption about the practitioner. So how important is it to kind of allay those fears and to let the person, when they come into your office, know that you're not just going to tell them to abandon the thing that they have this kind of love-hate relationship with?
Yeah. I usually preface a lot of the initial sessions with that a disclaimer that I'm not going to tell you to stop lifting or stop tracking. It's often a lot more effective that the client identify whatever it is they need to stop for themselves in the same way that they came into therapy on their own. The more they do the aha moments by themselves, the more effective and lasting treatment is. So they get to decide how much training is good for them and how little it is not.
Yeah, that client-led or the client or patient-led approach, I think goes a long way in almost every discipline of health, fitness, etc., to allaying those fears. If the person comes into the office and one of the first rules is, hey, you're in charge here. This is your body. This is your mind. This is your goals. This is your life. I'm going to help you figure out some things, and I have some perspectives that hopefully can help you. But you get to do with that what you want. Man, I wish it was more prevalent. And I remember a time where that was definitely not the status quo. Where I've gone into physical therapist's office or chiropractors, and they go, yeah, well, what do you think about maybe just swimming? And I'm like, or I have a
LOL.
Yeah, like you have a client who comes back and they're in a place where they have more fear, or more, or they feel like they have less agency than they had, to have, a clinician, psychological or physical, tell them that, the thing that they, at least at their best, love is probably should be taken off the table. And to do it so callously and without them thinking about it, it's kind of this, even though there's a problem with like that, maybe where the person needs to get to, but to just so callously throw it out there instead of, like you said, getting the person to acknowledge and make the decision for themselves, that's actually what's going to last. Like, I almost think I don't know if those clinicians realize it when they throw those things out there, that all the person's going to do is either ignore them, go back to what they're doing, go for a second opinion, which is probably the best option, or just simply not have a coping strategy for what is the real issue that they came in for. So it's kind of always been a tragic thing to see that when it happens, and it often turns the person away and gives them kind of this predisposition towards not respecting or thinking it's a good thing to go get help.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Alberto, have you experienced anything like with your clients?
I think for start, I've seen people use their issue like in a positive way, or they put a timeline on it. I can think of one powerlifter right now who legit has for example, like he knows the kind of stress the sport puts on his body physically mostly, and he's like, he said this. He's like, I'm not planning on doing the Bryce Lewis thing and like lifting into my 30s. He's like, I want to be really freaking good now and like get out, and like leave it all on the table. And I'm like, okay, well that's it's like I'm willing to trash my body, but I got 3 years to do that, and like that's it, And I remember there was one bodybuilder in particular. He was super helpful to me, like way back in the day. This was the year I got my pro card, and talk about crazy genetics. Like he was this like just this Nigerian sprinter that was just born out the womb with like muscles everywhere. And he was a very high level NPC bodybuilder at a certain point, but he was like totally there. Like he was just super neurotic, super crazy, had no social life, just kind of, he lived in the bodybuilding bubble for a good 4 or 5 years. And he told himself that was his timeline. He's like, I'm gonna be nuts and I'm gonna live for this bodybuilding thing for like 4 or 5 years. And then I'm done. And that's exactly what he did. And very normal guy. His leftovers were still so freaking like crazy impressive. So just kind of a side note that sometimes these things, like I guess they can kind of be used for good. Like the whole Kobe Bryant thing right now with the Mamba mentality. Like a lot of people don't really know what that is. Like people think Mamba mentality is like showing up 5 minutes early to like your job interview, and it's like no. Like you guys don't understand. Like everyone hated Kobe when he was in the midst of his like Mamba mentality peak. Like he would test his teammates hated him. It was horrible to play with him. You'd win, but he would like everything was competitive. Like he was like I think a lion was a better example, and how cruel like male lions can be to each other. Like that was Kobe. Like it was not a good place to be, and I think that's why he was so chill like post retirement, because he's like, all right, I kind of get to finally put that away. I've done everything I could in the sport, but he was in many ways, I'd say, worse than Michael Jordan in regards to like how how nice he was to be around, because of, guess, the stuff he was letting himself do that I guess it's debatable as to whether it's probably not healthy, but it worked to his advantage in his sport. So I like athletes that are that aware about that, and like they're like, you know what, I'm gonna make these sacrifices, and it's something that like this is what I want to do. It's like I want to chase that IFBB pro card, and you know, it's like for example, that's a hard decision when it comes to like hardly ever is it made responsibly, hardly ever, but like when it comes to anabolics, for example, it's like you do know it encompasses a lot of that, and if it's well thought out, and you know they're doing it the right way with quotes, do your thing, you know, and so I've seen athletes kind of take it there where they're doing things that are like not necessarily super healthy, but competitive sports aren't, you know, when you really stop and think about it, you know. I tried playing one league basketball game here, and it was just totally different compared to when I played like just with whoever was shooting. It's like, okay, now I'm getting elbowed in the face. Like this is no, I'm not willing to do that. But in regards to like fixing it, like someone who comes out better, the closest thing I've done to that, again, it's like go see someone, don't come see a bodybuilding coach, because I can really only get you jacked or peel fat off you. Is probably whenever you get someone who has issues with the whole body dysmorphia thing, and you get them to appreciate their body because of the things it can do. So I think like I'm kind of torn about the power building thing, because I think it it did lead some people astray when it comes to like physique development, but it helped out a lot of people, and it made some people even realize that, you know what, like I just really like lifting weights and getting stronger, and I don't need anyone there to understand how good it feels to deadlift 500 pounds like the first time, because I felt that like through my own body, and I appreciate that, and it was so personal, and it was so intimate. So closest thing to that is going to be, probably getting them to focus on the cool things their body can do while they're in the midst of like not knowing necessarily how they feel about the way their body looks.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think sometimes because in our Western world we look up to primarily team sport athletes and combat athletes, we adopt some of these mentalities that we take into what we do recreationally as adults, which is typically fitness, lifting weights, CrossFit, or something like that. Occasionally, that might actually get into, like you said, a rec basketball league or join a BJJ gym or whatever it is. But a lot of times, at least in our community, people who lift, I think there's a huge incompatibility between what a basketball player or a fighter or a team sport athlete needs to do to get into that place where they're, A, it's not just them alone. They've got a team they're with. And B, sometimes it doesn't matter what you do. You're going to lose to this other team. Or sometimes it matters 100% of your mentality, and you have to be that shark in the water to win. And that is so wholly different from the mentality that you may or may not need to succeed on any given day in the gym or through a contest prep or on the platform, etc., where it's this very personal kind of relationship with what you're doing. And it's much more of this, I think, potentially, when you look at people who've been in the iron game a long time, you see different personalities than what you see compared to the Kobes or the Michael Jordans. And I came across this cool paper, a qualitative paper, where they interviewed a bunch of world champions from Olympic sports, and a lot of them were from individual sports and you know, endurance athletes, sprinters, racers, things like that, to where, you're going head to head with somebody, but really it's just about you. There's no defense, there's no reaction, there's no offense. It's just you put in your best effort. And they had just a much healthier perspective. And they just seemed in general to have a much better outlook than what you often see in some of these kind of head-to-head things. And I think we often do ourselves a disservice I can't remember what I was talking about. That might have been even just in one of our meetings recently, but I was mentioning how the typical archetype of a way a physique athlete tries to improve when they are not at where they want to be is they try to control more variables. They take their circle of their constraints and they make it tighter. They try to control their environment. And what that eventually leads them to is there's so many behaviors, so many variables they check that it leads to burnout, And I think that whole mentality of, I'm going to come in, I'm going to do this for 5 years and then I'm out. It's almost the assumption that that's the pathway that is best, rather than potentially knowing that there's a time to shrink that bubble a little bit. But ideally, what can be the circle of what's optimal? What can be things that you can operate within? The conditions in which you could be at your best, expanding that gives you the ability to stay in the sport as long as you want. Because as much as you can frame it as a choice, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do this for 5 years, and I know that'll either be the limit of my body or my mind that I'm out. That's a pathway that only gives you one choice. You're accepting these limitations that may or may not be real. It may be that there was a way to powerlift or a way to bodybuild which gave you the opportunity to compete into your Masters 2 or 3. But if the archetype you have is the Mamba mentality, potentially, and probably a more limited view of that, then that does become the reality. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. So yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with being competitive and having that drive and using some of those really obsessive aspects of our personality, the double-edged sword of being a bodybuilder, for good. But I also think a lot of the times people get in these situations where something becomes psychopathological, where they think there's only one way forward, and they look up one day and they are trapped by their behavior. In my personal experience as a coach, a lot of the times where I see body dysmorphia is this whole, I'm going to embody the improvement mentality. Like I've got subjectively great physique. Anyone on the street would think I'm amazing. My immediate response to that is, yeah, well, I could be better. I'm never satisfied, And I can think of a number of bodybuilders who got to this place where they don't even like the sport anymore because they're always looking at what they can improve and never stopping to smell the flowers, if you will. And I know for me, it's always been useful to look back at what I looked like before I even started lifting and reminding myself that I did not give a shit that I was a 6 foot, 160 to 170 pound skinny dude who didn't lift weights and ate cheese when he wanted to for no reason. And then to now be like, yeah, of course I can improve my body. Like it doesn't have to be black or white. I don't have to see only my flaws and only be driven to improve. I can acknowledge the fact that I made tremendous gains and also be like, yeah, and I have a lot of work to do if I want to get my WNBF Pro card. They can coexist. But I think a lot of the times the messaging we get and the beliefs we get from these kind of extreme athletic personalities make us think that's not an option. That mentality doesn't exist. That healthy but still aggressive and progress-driven mentality can't exist. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense for individual sports. For sports where there's opponents and then also you're trying to weed out your teammates, like the Kobe thing makes sense. But when it comes to our thing, it's people get in their way much more than I think any other sport I can think of, to be honest. Because again, it's like a round the clock thing. So there's so many ways you can shoot yourself in the foot outside of just like, did your practice / training go well? Yeah, no, I agree 100% with that. He definitely. I guess he just didn't want to hassle with it, and he just wanted that life experience for like 5 years or so, and he was going to get the most out of it. And if that meant maybe checking off some boxes that he didn't have to, it's like I think when you give yourself a timeline like that because you want to do a bunch of other things, that makes a whole lot of sense.
I will also say that I think physically it makes a lot more sense too. Like I can sort of understand as a dude who's turning 37 this year, has had some previous injuries, and I'm doing Olympic lifting. I'm like, I may not be able to Olympic lift with the kind of like the amount I want to give to it, or the effort, the time, and the volume and intensity forever, and that's okay. Like that's certain things are simply just young people things, and physically. But I think while there are parallels between physical and mental pain, disorder, quote unquote, injury, quote unquote, like, I think it's difficult to get into bodybuilding, go all hardcore, develop a body image disorder, an eating disorder, and then be like, sweet, I'm just going to exit that easily. Like,
I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like if you have, for example, myself, if I had decided once I had pain squatting below parallel and I, like my labrum was torn and I needed to eventually get FAI surgery, I pretty much decided to get surgery so I could keep squatting heavy below parallel, and actually just below parallel at all. But if I had just decided, you know what, I don't want to squat anymore, I wouldn't have needed to get surgery, at least not for the next 15 years or so. So I could have just left it. But you don't typically get to just walk away from an eating disorder,
Mm-hmm.
No,
Yeah, very few
really
people
don't.
who shouldn't be doing this on paper do they say like, you know what, this makes sense. This just isn't for me. I'm gonna go get this fixed. That's just not the reality. I've yet to see that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very complex. It's very interwoven, again, with core beliefs, with a pattern of behaviors that have been repeated many, many, many times and ingrained. So to just say, all right, I'm done, is ideal, but it's not realistic. It really isn't. And I know I have to recognize that we have a system, like we have the definitions of pathology that categorize people into certain mental illnesses or whatever medical condition. However, I think it's up to the individual to say when they've had enough. Just like the athlete that you were describing, like they were done in 4 or 5 years. All right, that's as much as they can take. And I think the same goes for the body dysmorphia. How much are you able to tolerate? When do you say like, all right, this is an issue. When do I want to address this? Mm-hmm. And then peeling the layers of the onion, because it's very complex.
This actually reminds me a little bit of some of the discussions we've had with Nick on graded exposure. And it's just interesting how, like we have this kind of mind-body way of looking at things, this separation between the two, as though we're not just one organism of organs, and it all kind of operates on some of the same ways at a philosophical level, but that the way that you were describing helping someone change behavior is this graded exposure to imagine yourself not tracking for one day, or training the number of days that actually fit your schedule versus the obsessive need to train daily or twice a day or whatever it is. First, imagine it, then we'll try it. Then you get the feedback of nothing happened. I didn't die or get fat or lose my physique or become unworthy like that negative core belief told me. That's the same way to someone who has pain doing a certain movement. Nick would be like, well, let's find the range of motion you can do. Maybe even let's visualize the movement. I know that is sometimes a potential thing you're doing. And find the load, find the range of motion, find the tempo, and find the portion of that movement that we can do. And then we'll go from there in the stepwise manner. And you get to be the guardian, the gatekeeper of how much you do, how quickly you increase load, what you try. And I think really important, what directly connects what you were just saying, Amanda, is that a lot of the times Nick says, hey, the goal isn't necessarily to be pain-free. The goal is for you to get to a level of pain that you can accept and live with while doing what you hope and want to do. And I think the parallel there, from if I was hearing you right, and I'd love to get your thoughts on if I'm feeding this back correctly, is that someone may always have these anxious moments, this what may eventually become defined by the DSM or just by the patient, something subclinical or no longer a problem, but it doesn't mean that they won't have a certain level of anxiety, they won't have these concerns, they won't be this voice in the back of their mind, but that the volume and the frequency on that voice and the degree to which they buy into that message that they're telling themselves becomes livable, and that they get the agency of being able to live their life in a way that they accept and they're happy with, and that, is different than what originally brought them into your office.
Right. Yes, I agree. It's kind of like tuning a radio station. after a while, someone with an eating disorder or having negative beliefs, like they have their radio set to a certain station and it's kind of programmed in there. It's on the easy function. You just click button number 1 and that's the station. And little by little, you start shifting and finding other channels or different thought patterns. And you start tuning your radio to that station instead. However, you still have access to that old station. So it's kind of like just reprogramming the mind, the beliefs, the feelings to create new ones.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a really, really good analogy. I hope that the listener can get a little bit of a better idea of kind of the complexity of this, and rather than kind of like I framed it initially like this kind of poo-pooing, like, yeah, dysmorphia. People think bodybuilding is dysmorphia, but look, that's just the sport. Like, this is a thing that can be almost disguised by the sport. I wanted to ask you, Berto, I mean, I'll frame this question first. I feel like a lot of the times what I do with my clients, what is in my scope, is helping them just become aware that maybe the way they're seeing things is not making them happy and is going to potentially lead to burnout, and then helping them reframe it. Like, one of the things that I said, man, way back in like 2009 was, hey, you need to see your physique on a bodybuilding stage differently than the way you see yourself in the mirror on Thursday. You know, like when you get on stage, that's like throwing a 90-mile-per-hour fastball coming in with striated glutes. And it is something to be judged on a separate scale from, you know, am I a beautiful person, or do I have worth, or what is my intrinsic value? Because it's so easy, especially with these divisions that kind of really are more subjective now, like beauty, presentation, even sass. I've heard judges talk about as something that they're actually taking into account. Coming into play, I think that makes it really difficult to make those separations. So, Berto, how do you help some of your clients reframe? Or is that the primary way you address this when they bring these types of things up? How do you help them navigate when it seems like their competitive physique or the sport is contributing to how they see themselves negatively?
Yeah, no, that the new divisions definitely, I think, made the water a bit murkier, because in some cases, what you were aiming to look like as a bodybuilder was just something that was rebelling against like what is, you know, commonly seen as attractive. You know, like it's if you're a dude, it's like, you know, like probably all our mom's concerns when we decided we want to do this is like, really, you want to look like those dudes in the magazines that are just like, you know, 250 pounds and, you know, they look like part animal, part person. And even more so when you were female. Like if you were female and you wanted to do this bodybuilding thing, it's like, wow, you really don't give a fuck. Like this is like really for you. And yeah, now with these classes, it's like, man, they're almost, to some extent, they are big sexy classes. So that it's, and man, like I don't have an answer for that necessarily, but I think the more I simplify this bodybuilding thing for people, the more the less steps, and the more we can be just as effective usually. That's usually one of the first things like I think a really good coach does. It's like, you know what? This is so simple, but it's gonna be super effective. The person does, and they're like, holy crap, that blew my mind. You know, like I've never had to ride this smooth before. So I think doing that, I think that is huge when you give them less boxes to check, because now they have all this empty time, and hopefully they use that empty time to like work on other things. You know, it's like, okay, I'm gonna be a better husband or wife, or I'm gonna be a better student. So I think the best thing I can do for an athlete is just like all the little neurotic things that they're doing, simplify it. And part of the protocol often is it's like, you know what, we're going to train covered up for the next 3 months, and I want you to, you know, minimize your physique checks. And that's part of simplifying things, you know, where we're only going to look at your physique, you know, every 8 weeks when we're gaining, and that's basically it. And I want you to fog up them windows before that mirror before you hop in the shower. Not really, but you know, like just really try to avoid that and focus more so on the process and the checklist that I give them. I think that it just gives them more room to to work on other things that are actually going to, like, as well, make them feel good about themselves. I think that's the biggest thing, because we've all been there when our checklist was just way too big, and if we missed 2 things in that day, we felt not so good about ourselves. So when you make that smaller, and now they're doing the bodybuilding thing, and they're doing it really well according to their coach, and they're making progress, and they're doing all these other things that in the past maybe bodybuilding didn't let them do, like, hey, have a Friday night dinner date with their significant other. It really, it can help change the person for the better. Obviously, if things are just too out there and too nutty, it's like, you know what, like, we're 4 weeks post show and you're not okay with gaining weight, I think we need to go see somebody, so at a certain point, just like you would outsource it, some sort of physical ailment. Same thing with the mental stuff. But that's what's worked really well for me, is just simplifying their bodybuilding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if there's less variables to manage, it doesn't start to resemble that whole OCD checklist of trying to get all these things, which can trigger old behaviors or even create its own problem. Since we're talking about muscle dysmorphia, which has to do with let's just say an unhealthy way of viewing your body and evaluating it, I think the topic of physique checking is really important, because it's one of those things you have to do for bodybuilding, but it is also described in the literature as the behavior that is a facilitator of keeping this going. It's a behavior that enables these behaviors that are causing stress. So Jake Lenardin, doctor who's specifically studies binge eating, and who I've talked to, and we've had write for 3DMJ, and he's been on the Iron Culture podcast. He really kind of put it very simply. It's like, when you do a physique check, not for bodybuilding purposes, but just checking on yourself for some of these kind of pathological reasons, if you will, it's always the same answer. If you're doing all these negative behaviors, like if you have an unhealthy relationship with food and training, and you're training probably too hard, you're eating too restrictively, and you do a physique check and you like what you see, sweet, keep it up. You're doing great. If you don't like what you see, well, keep it up. You got to change it. Like, there's no real positive outcome from that. Mm. And I think when he explained it that way, I was like, oh shit, you're right. And I was thinking about my last contest prep, where you become so focused on improving your physique and seeing what you can bring to the table on stage. Every time your shirt comes off, or you take a shower, or you change out of your gym clothes, you're checking to see if there's new cuts, or if you've made more progress. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it very rarely results in some kind of positive emotion or feeling or good thing that would happen if you didn't just have that as part of your regular process of your weekly check-in or your standard way of looking at it. So something that, since kind of having that revelation, that I do with clients, is that I tell them, I don't want you checking your physique out outside of the bounds of when it's part of our process. So our weekly, posing routine that we go through, record it, send it to me, and we'll review your physique together. So it's for a specific purpose at a specific time when we think progress should have potentially been made. And then maybe when we get closer to actual peak week, I want to see some of those more, variations day to day based on what variables we manipulated in terms of your peak week plan. But outside of that, no looky, because there's no potential upside there. We're not gaining any benefit that we're not going to have from the structure that's already in place. And it only opens the door to potentially feeling like crap, or chasing ghosts, or just kind of ruining a day that otherwise could have gone quite well. Like, you're flat on a random Thursday when you're 12 weeks out. Who cares? You had too much broccoli because you were hungry, and you're retaining water in weird spots, and you look weird on a random Wednesday when you're 6 weeks out. Who cares? It doesn't benefit you to know that information. And all it does in a position like we talked about, where the proverbial straw is always ready to break the camel's back, just make you feel like crap. So yeah, it's I think it's one of those things where when we're in prep, we can justify, like, yeah, of course I'm checking out my physique. I'm going to get on stage. But it's like, are you checking out your physique, or are you just kind of doing something obsessive that really only has potential to harm you? Like, your check-in's on Saturday, It's Wednesday and you're taking your shower after the gym. You don't need to be spending all that time looking in the mirror. So I don't know. Is that something that you think is a good kind of low hanging fruit for athletes to take home? I think that can actually make a huge difference.
Yeah, I would think so. Just having more focus overall, it creates a greater risk to have just a negative outlook. It's more potential, more risk. And usually towards the end of contest prep, mood's low, overall just like irritability's high. So just like you said, it's not that great to do. And I think the motivation behind it serves as great information. And I think that will determine and just set the groundwork for how the outcome is going to turn out. Because like you said, if it's for a purpose, it's with intentionality, for a check-in, all right, this is what we got to do. We have to look at the physique for contest prep. However, if you're just doing it out of compulsion, it's serving a different need. It's serving a different purpose. And it's usually not fulfilling to the extent that you expect it to.
Yeah, I know for me, sometimes because I got leaner than I ever had in 2019, and I used to, and at certain times when my stress levels are high, or when I train a certain way or do a lot of cardio, I can have a lot of variability in my physique. So I remember, and I can think of 2009 and also 2019, but actually did have a positive outcome because it was so much better. But in 2009, I used to check, like, are my quads still there? Like, did they go away? And it became this obsessive thing. And like, if they were there, it was like, okay, thank God. But if they weren't, it was like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? What's going on? And start catastrophizing it. Like, well, how am I going to know if I actually have quads on stage? And it became this very negative thing that only added to it's just one more piece of stress to throw into this ball of stress that resulted in that outcome in the first place. And I've seen competitors do that, where it's almost like, and don't get me wrong, it is a pretty transient state to be in. We don't want to stay there. You don't want to stay shredded. And it is a relatively fragile state, but you have to actually get yourself in a sustained surplus for it to truly go away. You might have these little subtle shifts, but like there's just not a lot of positives there. When you're, like you said, out of a state of compulsion, checking like, oh, do I still have it? It is a fear-based decision, when you really think about it. And it may be something where you kind of breathe a sigh of relief when you look, but, do you need to be looking in the first place? Is it facilitative? And it may be that you see something you don't like. And I think the nature of contest prep, where you're trying to reach a certain level of condition, and I will say there is this sigh of relief when you actually do get into really good stage shape, because the work is done. Unfortunately, that comes at a point when you're basically crazy and tired and fatigued, so it's never quite the sigh of relief that you hoped for. But I can say that, yeah, once you get shredded, once you're there, it is really nice to be like, oh, thank God, okay, I made it. And there is kind of this feeling that you can coast if you're doing it right, and if you're ready early or on time. But I think because you're all encompassed and focused on getting to that point, you're much more likely to look at what you don't have in terms of your conditioning than what you do have. And I think that typically leads to this very one-sided relationship, to where you're always striving to do better with very little appreciation, or kind of being able to acknowledge the success you've had, which I think we've got a lot of data. There's a classic study I've cited many times, where focusing purely on the outcome for the reason you exercise makes it less likely for you to exercise as long compared to focusing on the experience and being in the moment. So if you can look at, you've only been dieting 8 weeks and you've got a great pair of abs. Of course you don't have, striated glutes yet. That's fine. You're exactly where you need to be. That's kind of being the equivalent of the process. You're where you are supposed to be now, and you can accept it. But I think more often than not, people are just looking at, am I shredded yet? And that means that 80% of your prep, at best, even if you get ready early, you're just looking at what you don't have and seeing yourself as not good enough. And if you have an underlying, negative core belief, or you've used to have, body image or eating disorders in the past linked to the way you saw yourself, that's a really easy way to get back into that kind of negative pattern. So I think Yeah, some of the stuff that I can recommend is kind of remind yourself of where you think you should be based upon where you are in your prep. Appreciate that, and also do the physique checks in a scheduled, purposeful manner, rather than just every time you have the opportunity, or to try to calm some fear, because I'd say there's very little potential upside and a fair amount of potential downside to taking that approach. Berto, any thoughts? I think we're starting to come to a place of conclusion, perhaps.
So I follow this Instagram page where it's about influencers doing weird things, like just standing in the middle of traffic to get the shot, things like that. One of the things that I hate the most about contest prep is it for like marketing purposes. I have to do that. So like if you look and you really stop, it's like a lot of my pictures that are out there, they're just as weird as like that person that takes a picture of themselves like in the shower, like and some sad quote underneath. I hate doing it. I hate doing it because it knocks me off my center when I do that. Because like what is one of the biggest knocks on me that Jeff will always tell me is like, you're posing. Like, you need to work. And to this day, I've gotten better, but I almost don't take myself there for that reason, and that's certainly something I have to work on, because I don't want to be just. I don't want like my focus to be on what I look like 24/7. Like this sport it feels like that as it is. So when I have to do that, it's like, oh God, okay, I need to take some sort of like sick shot, because at the end they do serve as cool memoirs, but they also, it's part of the job, I guess, in some way. But I made that mistake of doing that the first time I got peeled. It was over a decade ago. And afterwards, that's part of the reason that it took me so long to reverse out. I was like, no, you're never doing this thing again. It's like, go back to perhaps being that guy that doesn't really care about his appearance as much as I think even many men, like man, like, and we do this joking around, but how often will like bodybuilders kind of like retake more pics and like what their girlfriends like insist on retaking? It's like, like, because we didn't look right, let's do this thing again, right? So it can be a serious illness, and then like contest prep just makes it even worse, because you literally can get to the point, even when you're peeled, you're so transparent that you can change hour to hour, and it could make you think all sorts of things that that again doesn't really matter at the end, because you're 12 weeks out and you're flat. Like, who cares? But yeah, no, I do my best with that, because it's a very easy trap to fall in, especially when you're really liking the way you look. And last prep was probably the best I've done at that, but I think this next prep, if anything, I wanna do a James Harrison thing, and I want to work out in gray sweats like the whole time. I think that would be obviously make some space for like cool videos for marketing purposes, but like I find the most peace when it's like you said, man, just focusing more so on the process, more so on like what that perfect physique is, and complaining to myself or not cutting myself enough slack because I'm not there right now. So it's a slippery slope with this thing, man.
Absolutely.
Makes you strong as crap, though, I'll tell you that. Like, that's the one thing about bodybuilding. If you do it right, man, it's just not just your pecs that get strong, but it's everything. If you really listen to I guess the whispers that are going on all the time.
Like your triceps. I hear you.
My triceps, yeah. I got no triceps. There we go, body dysmorphia. I got no triceps.
I love how that's what you heard. Yeah. I actually was joking that you meant making you a stronger emotionally person, and I was like, oh, like you make your triceps stronger too. But you just managed to hear, Eric, you taking a shot at my triceps. So still got more work to do here on the team 3DMJ. I don't know if you knew that one of those D's stood for dysmorphia, but it does. So yeah, I think to close out, Rizzo, what would you say are some of the primary things people need to understand from this podcast, as far as what dysmorphia is, what it's linked to, and then what someone can do if they are struggling with it?
Body dysmorphia is definitely debilitating. It can be very debilitating, and it can be socially isolating, not just trapped up in the mind, but it could take you away from things you love. and to reach out to someone, because you're not the only one out there, for sure. Just say how you're feeling and make sure it's someone that you trust as well, whether it's a professional or someone close to you. Other takeaway points: there's a way out. It's just a matter of shifting your beliefs, shifting your perspective. It's not just black and white. There's definitely other ways of thought. What else did I miss?
I know. I think those are really important. Just knowing that there is a potential out. You can get help, and you are not alone. And hell, I'll plug yourself for you. If anyone is struggling with this, you can always go to our website, check out Amanda's profile. She is contactable, and she's amazing. I'll go ahead and just say it. So yeah, I just want to thank you guys both, Berto, for your perspective, both as an athlete and a coach. Amanda, for what you do for our team and just being the awesome clinician and person you are. Semi potentially related, do check out our new course, Transitioning Away from Tracking. I know that is oftentimes tied up into this sort of thing, and it may give someone at least one less thing to manage in a way that could potentially be negative. And yeah, my main takeaway was, keep your self-identity and your sporting physique separate. Use physique checking in a facilitative manner, and like Berto said, really ensure that you're managing the variables that need to be managed. But over time, you're not trying to get better by shrinking the way you live and controlling more and more of your environment, but making more and more of your environment fit within the mold of optimal. So you become a more resilient athlete rather than someone who tries to eliminate more and more things from their life. So thank you for tuning into the 3D&J podcast, and we will catch you next time.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.